if it's okay with you, would you mind just starting off by introducing yourself and a little bit about the company and the topic that you cover at the moment?
Yes, my name's Sue Turner. Amongst other things, I am the founder of a company called AI Governance Ltd. Various other roles and hats that I wear, which we might come on to later. But the main thing that I'm interested in these days is AI, artificial intelligence. And I've got a mission to inspire as many people and organisations as possible to use AI with wisdom and integrity. And it's the wisdom and integrity that's the really tricky bit. So yeah, I'd love to talk more to you about that.
Brilliant. I think it's an incredibly important topic for today. I think, you know, technology has evolved significantly over the past 5-10 years and stuff, and AI has been a core part of that. And I think everybody initially thought AI would be, not to sound too naive, robots and rather big, scary, apocalyptic type technologies. And instead it's been an incredibly useful tool for a number of sectors, healthcare being one of them, businesses in general, just how we can, it's helped how we interact with clients, customers, patients even. What has been, I guess, the main inspiration for you for getting into this field?
What brought me into the AI field was really so many organisations that I've worked for and worked with have lots of data, and it might be sitting on spreadsheets and it's sitting in CRM databases and it's all over the organisation. But it's not really used very well, and people don't have the tools to drill into it and understand what it's actually trying to tell them. So the last organisation I was running, I was Chief Executive at Quartet Community Foundation, one of the UK's oldest and biggest community foundations, and we were making 1,000 grants a year to all sorts of wonderful, wonderful people and organisations. And each time people would write back to us and give us a report about what had happened with the grant that we'd given them. And we had all this data, all these words sitting in a system, but we couldn't analyse it to find out what the impact of the grants we were making was. So we said, you know, we've heard about this thing called artificial intelligence. It's supposed to be really good at finding hidden patterns in data. So how do we use it to analyse all these words? And we talked to people at Bristol University, and we talked to all sorts of interesting people, and they all sort of scratched their heads and said, not really sure, or don't know how. And so that a few years ago is what alerted me to the fact that artificial intelligence was out there, but it seemed to be a tool that only a few people could use. And my whole mission in life is to distribute power better. You know, to make sure that people who are disadvantaged have more opportunities, and to say, well, if some technology is just held as the tool of a few in the elite, how do we make that available to everybody? So that sent me on this pathway, and I discovered that the government were putting together some master's courses, or backing universities to put together some master's courses on artificial intelligence and data science, specifically aimed at people who were not mathematicians, who were not computer scientists, who could come from any other background but not those. So to bring in diverse people into AI and data science. And I thought, that's me, I've got to go and do this. So I took a year to do the master's degree in AI and data science, and now what I'm doing is using my knowledge to really simplify what AI is all about, demystify it, don't talk about maths at all, but make sure that people are getting the ideas that they can then use these tools for in their businesses, in their personal lives, and wherever it is. So it's really about shifting the power, if you like, so that AI isn't something that's for the elite, it's for all of us.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because I mean, just from my perspective, I've maybe got a little bit more insight than the average person just because of the sector that I work in. But to me, still, I would assume maths, I would assume software engineering, I would assume scary code and equations, which is absolutely not my strong point. Please ask my mother. And so when you kind of entered that field, did you have any feelings of kind of, you know, I don't want to say fear, that might be too strong a word, but just kind of a bit of caution, I guess.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, I've always liked maths, so I've always been the sort of person who's quite happy following logic and so on. And I remember when I was a teenager, I had a ZX Spectrum, which was one of these sort of little boxy computers with hardly any memory at all, and you had to sort of press 5 things at the same time to make it do anything. So I had some early experience of coding, but really nothing in the intervening years. So I wouldn't say I was a mathematical person or a coder or anything like that, and no computer science training at all. But I just wanted to know. And so I thought, I'm not going to let this put me off. I'm not going to self-censor and rule myself out of this world. I'm going to throw myself into it and see what happens. So yes, on the master's course, there were times, I've got to admit, when we were learning coding, had 5 weeks intensively at the beginning learning coding. And there were times in that where I just thought, I can't do this is too hard. And there were, you know, some other things would come up where other people seemed to be roaring away with it. And I felt like I was at the back of the class, as it were, and being the dunce. But I just decided to push through that and just keep persevering and get it and see what happened. And I ended up getting a distinction in the Masters, which at my great age was, I do have some grey cells, they are still working. So yeah, I was very pleased with that. And then, as I mentioned, what my main mission now when I'm talking to people and trying to enthuse people that AI could be really useful for their business is not to talk about maths. I never put any formulae up on the screen. I very rarely use any of the sort of classic wiring diagrams that try to express what neural networks are all about. I just talk in very simple language because at its heart, AI is just about finding patterns hidden in large amounts of data and then using those patterns to predict, to personalise or to automate. And who wouldn't want to do that in their business? So I'll give you an example if you like. There's a Harley Davidson dealership, and this is back from 2017. So if you're only just starting to use AI now, you've got to sort of say, crikey, people have been using it like this since 2017, I've got to catch up. And yes, you do, you have really got to catch up. Anyway, this Harley Davidson dealership in New York used a fairly simple bit of machine learning, so a type of AI, to analyse the data that they had on all their existing customers. Who were the customers who spent a lot of money and what were the characteristics of customers spending not so much? And they put it all together and let the AI sort of come up with patterns and hidden things in the data. They then used that in real time when new people were coming onto their website to say, aha, are we seeing the same patterns? Could these people be our high net customers of the future? They increased their sales leads by nearly 3,000%. And of course then went on to make a lot more money. So, which of us wouldn't want to increase our sales lead by 3,000%? We all would. So, these tools are not necessarily very complicated, but the key to it all is having that data, having something that you can get your hands around and organise. 85% of machine learning and AI and data science projects fail, which is quite scary. And a lot of that is because you just don't have the right data or can't organise the data or don't understand the data and what it's trying to tell you. So you've got to be very careful.
Yeah, that's really interesting actually, because I think traditionally speaking, people they collect as much data as possible in any format, in any way, shape or form. Every touch point you want to collect data. But if you're not utilising that correctly, then it just stays as data. There's nothing usable there. If a business was going to sort of start entering the field of using AI and utilising that data, what would you say would be the first steps for them to take?
Yeah, so I work with lots of companies when I've got them enthusiastic about the possibilities of AI. We also talk about the pitfalls, which we'll come on to later. But it's then, they say, how do I get started? I can't just go out and buy something off the shelf and plug into it. Well, you can actually. There are now AI tools that you can just plug in. So for human resources, for example, there's lots of tools that you can just give your data and you plug it into somebody else's model they've already created and it'll start to churn out and generate information for you which you wouldn't otherwise have. But the key thing I always say to people is understand what data you've got. I was with an organisation recently who had a brilliant idea for how they could spot vulnerabilities, potential vulnerabilities in their customers. I thought, that's really good. They're really caring about the customers, but they just didn't have the data. They weren't collecting it to be able to start to build a model and then spot these vulnerabilities. So my message to them was get more data. And then we'll work up from there. And the key thing I always say to businesses is start small, because it can be daunting, it can be quite complicated, but you just got to start with something and then start to build on the possibilities from there. The other key message I always say to people is put the governance and the ethics bit in right from the beginning. Yeah. Now I would say that because my business is all about AI governance, but too many companies say to me, we'll do the governance bit later, let's just get a couple of models up and running and then we'll think about ethics and stuff. And that is so wrong to do that, because you then get sucked into it, and there's numerous examples of companies, even really big tech companies, that make horrendous mistakes. So you've got to do the thinking about, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Think about all that right from the start. Because the key thing about developers, people who are working in the AI world, is they are very often got no training in ethics at all. They don't think about governance. Nobody's ever told them that they should. So you need a lot of other people in the organisation to be saying, should we do this? Is this a right use of data? Should we be looking at our customers like this? What are the potential impacts on people? So looking at that bigger, rounder picture, and then having the discussion with the developers and saying, okay, now we've decided here are the guardrails. These are the things we won't do. These are the things we will do. Now go off and get something together that works for us.
Yeah, that's a great point actually, because we saw how many people and how many businesses, even like you mentioned, the bigger businesses that were bitten by GDPR when those regulations came in. So, I think if many organisations had started by looking at the governments and, like you mentioned, the ethics and regulations at the start, they probably wouldn't have paid such a significant price what was it, a few years ago when those rules came in. With the, I suppose, the governance and ethics then, what type of advice would you give to organisations when they're kind of starting that process? What type of frameworks should they consider?
Well, this isn't a message that people particularly like, but the truth is they need to have some sort of body, some sort of structure within the organisation that can think about ethics. So you might call it an ethics committee. Now, if you're a very sort of entrepreneurial company, you've got committee, we don't want committees. Okay, don't call it a committee then, call it a group, call it a think tank, call it whatever you want to call it. But you've got to get a group of people together who have the authority of the board, so real top level authority to talk about ethics and make decisions. And that's not necessarily that complicated. If you think about it, you're probably already doing quite a lot of corporate social responsibility. You've been doing that for years. So that's saying what your values are and what you do and don't do as an organisation. You may well have done quite a lot of work on environment, social and governance matters, particularly things like climate change. That, again, same sort of thing, isn't it? It's about saying, well, we'll go this far, but we won't do that. These are what we find acceptable. So put all that together, layer on top of it some thinking about data, what we will and won't use it for, and you've got yourself an ethics committee or group or whatever it is you want to call it. So that sort of group can then do the thinking, but it has to be a standing group. It can't be something that the chief executive can just dismiss and get rid of next month, and it has to have authority. So it can't be something that the board can ignore if they find its message is inconvenient. And some big companies, very big tech companies, have got this wrong, and they've set up committees which they then ignore, or they've set up groups that are then disband after 6 months. Yep. So you've got to give it authority in order to have real impact. And then you've got to have some expertise coming into it from outside the organisation. Because if we just take, in any of our organisations, we just take what we know and what we're passionate about, that's great, but it doesn't really tell us about the impacts on society. So one of the things that myself and a group of us working around the world on AI standards are talking about is how you get input and feedback from a really wide group of stakeholders. And that's your customers, obviously, but it's also wider society that you're going to impact on. So, for example, I mentioned HR tools. There's lots of AI tools that you can use in the HR world, so analysing what's going on with your staff, predicting things about future staff. You can very easily use tools out of the box with no coding necessary that can interview people for you. So you've got 1,000 CVs, well, you're never going to look through them all, but you can send out a message to 1,000 people to do a video recorded interview, and then the AI can tell you, here are the 5 people you should interview. Wow, brilliant. Yeah. But there are pitfalls with it. And the things you've got to think through. There's a brilliant documentary that came out very recently on BBC 3 from a reporter called Daniel Henry, and it's called Computer Says No. Okay. And it's all about these sorts of HR tools and how the fact that we know from research that these computer vision systems, they were more likely to view a person of colour's facial expression as negative compared to a white person's facial expression. They are more likely to look at a person who is neurodiverse and who's perhaps looking away from the camera, perhaps taking more pauses, more time to think before they answer, more likely to look at those people as negative. So that means they're less likely to get the job interview if you're wanting somebody who the computer perceives as smiling a lot and making lots of direct eye contact with the camera. So it's discriminating against people. So you may go from your 1,000 CVs to the 5 that you actually want to interview, but it could have discarded people who, A, could be brilliant at doing the job, and B, it's discarded them potentially on discriminatory grounds. Yeah. So you've got to really understand what the tool is doing and how it's doing it, and that's that job of the ethics committee. Understand it.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting, actually. And I think this kind of goes back to, I suppose, the environment that this technology is tested in, isn't it? If it's only tested against a very specific demographic of people, then it's only going to learn from and recognise that very specific demographic of people. So no, that's really interesting. And I think consistency is one of the main things as well, and that's what that committee or trust or think tank, whatever you want to call it, like you said, can bring to the table is that level of consistency, so that as the company grows, then the ethics and the governance grows with it. On the kind of same sort of scale of that then is having an outside perspective, because tunnel vision, I think, is a real risk here. I think if you're too ingrained in the company, part of you is always going to be, how will this benefit the company? Absolutely. And you lose then the kind of the oversight that you should be bringing to the table, which is, okay, we need to put, how can this value the company to one side? And we need to think about how is this going to benefit society and make sure that we stay on the right side of the governance and ethics and so on. So, there's so many nuances to it. It's incredibly brilliant technology, but at the same time, it's a bit of an untamed beast.
So yeah, it is very much an untamed beast. I give lots of presentations to people and groups where I talk about the potential and the pitfalls of AI. And we get really excited about the potential. You might say, okay, so it can decide who gets a loan for buying a car or mortgage to buy a house or whatever. Brilliant, so much more efficient than the old way of doing things, less paper and so on, taking in all these different data points that the human brain could never possibly all put together in a systematic way. But then there are pitfalls. So on that loan application side, we've seen this in real life data that certain geographical areas, certain postcodes, or in America zip codes, have a propensity of a certain demographic, certain socioeconomic type, certain racial type. And we've found that these loan decision-making algorithms can discriminate against people. You're in that postcode, therefore we won't give you a loan, or we will give you a loan, but we'll make the interest rate higher for you. That's not judging on the individual, that's judging against certain stereotypes. And it gets even more complicated because the data might not actually have the data about the person's racial characteristics, for example, or age, but it's inventing it. It's saying, well, you seem to be similar to these other people, and therefore I'm going to assume this about you. So it's a proxy that it's created, and building the bias in through that proxy. So yeah, it is complicated to get it right. But the main thing when I'm making presentations to people is to say to them, don't let that put you off. Let that make you ambitious to get it right and ambitious to push through to the next level rather than thinking, oh, I'll back away. It's like the internet. I'm old enough to remember the days working before the internet existed. Well, it existed, but nobody was using it, And then email came along, and then we all got websites. And over a period of 10 years, the way we did business changed. What's happening with AI, particularly after COVID, is the way we're doing business is changing incredibly rapidly. So massive change and massive difference that it's making to people's working lives and ways of doing business. And if we don't actually get to grips with it as individuals in our businesses, then someone else will come along and steal the market out from under us. So we can't just say, oh, it's a bit complicated, I'll leave it for a few years. We've got to get to grips with it now.
Yeah, so many businesses were kind of left behind because they didn't adopt the internet when it was in its infancy. And the same with things like smartphones and so on. There were companies that didn't adopt the Apple model of the touchscreen phone and so on. So it's important for businesses to recognise when there genuinely is an opportunity to innovate and kind of take that bull by the horns and get on board now in the correct way, because that equally the same thing could happen 10 years down the line when we realise this has actually grown too significant, kind of like Facebook is now, isn't it? And it's kind of damaged the reputation of the platform a little bit.
Yeah.
And I guess just to take it back from the customer's perspective, there's so much more information now, and I think more awareness on how data is used more than ever before, I think, because of all of the, how Facebook has utilised it, all of the GDPR changes, cookies are now, there's more awareness about how cookies are stored. If a customer saw that a business was using AI, what sort of systems can the business put in place to kind of, I suppose, mitigate those factors and concerns?
So GDPR is a really good example of how AI is layering on top of things that we are kind of used to, but perhaps not still doing as well as we might. And so there's a group of us around the world who are devising standards for companies to come up to in how they use AI. And the first of those standards that we're all working on is about GDPR. So we may think in our businesses, oh yeah, tick, did GDPR a couple of years ago, can ignore that. Nobody in the world is using GDPR as it's supposed to be used, and that's the EU version and the UK version, which really are pretty much the same thing. So when you layer AI on top of that, there's a whole lot of thinking that needs to be done in organisations. And so the group of us have devised an accreditation system for auditing the use of AI with reference to GDPR. We're waiting in the UK for the Information Commissioner's Office to look at what we've devised. It's a group called For Humanity, which is an American not-for-profit. And we hope the Information Commissioner's Office will say, yeah, this is what we need, and they will then have this audit standard for companies to come up to. And in it contains lots and lots of detail of things that they will need to prove that they do in order to get certified as coming up to this new standard. And so it's going to look quite daunting from the outside, because it's things like having an ethics committee, having some other groups of people that look at the way you do things and processes and procedures. But it's a little bit like we're all used to having our accounts audited every year, and we just accept that. We just know what the standards are, we know how to achieve them, we do it, the auditors come in, and everything's hunky-dory. story. It took decades to get to the position where we were all comfortable with this system. We can't afford to do that with AI because it has such profound impacts on people's lives. We've got to get to that acceptance and understanding much more quickly. So at first, myself and AI Governance and a group of us around the world are working on helping companies get up to these new standards, and then the audit will kick in probably a couple of years down the line. The EU are putting together a new Artificial Intelligence Act, and I think the UK is going to do something similar. There's the Online Safety Act, there's the Children's Code. So all these different bits of legislation need something that says, if you're going to use artificial intelligence and you want to comply with these regulations, how do you do it? What are the systems that you need to put in place? How do you put a tick box to say that you've done all the right things? And a lot of it is about training people and giving people understanding, and then those outside voices and views to give you the perspective, so it's not just a small group of people in the organisation that know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that would definitely make it more accessible, I think. And you know, at the same point, you don't want to make it a tick box exercise, but you kind of want the simplicity of the tick box exercise, because then companies will see it, okay, this is now an integral core part of our process. Similarly to how now people are treating things like environmental and sustainability requirements, you know, they're putting things in place, and we've got solar panels and so on. It's important we're kind of laying the foundations for future generations. So if we can bring in, well, companies like yourself, if you can bring in these systems now, it would be significantly easier for future generations to use technology in kind of a safe environment for both the business and the customer then.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in the free market. So, you know, in my heart of hearts, I'd love it if we just say to businesses, these are the standards, here's some do's, here's some don'ts, go away and get on with it. But we've seen over the past decade that that isn't working with AI. Businesses are just not self-regulating in a responsible way. To give you an example, back in 2016, Microsoft, so, you know, a bit of a big company that ought to know how to get this stuff right, they put out a chatbot called Tay on Twitter. And the idea was that Tay was the digital equivalent of a female teenager, and Tay would chat with people through the medium of Twitter and learn and develop, and it would all be a wonderful experiment. They had to take Tay offline in less than 24 hours because in less than 24 hours it learnt to be a racist, Hitler-loving, feminist-bashing troll. And it was just extraordinary in such a short period of time, the negativity that could happen, which Microsoft hadn't foreseen, you know, all their big brains and ability to think about technology. Another example, perhaps more of a sort of financial boo-boo, as it were, there's a company in America called Zillow, which provides services to people that want to buy, sell or rent a home. And they recognised that actually they were pretty good at knowing what the sales price of a home would be and what the purchase price was. So they said, well, if somebody's willing to sell at this price, we, Zillow, could buy it and then sell it on again at this price, and there's a nice margin in between. So they put together an AI algorithm, tested it, and it worked. It worked at low volume. Once they actually put it out into the wild and had their customers using it, it came across data and situations that it hadn't been trained on, and it just didn't work. So Zillow lost about $300 million in the space of a few months, and they wiped $9 billion off their share price. Wow. So, you know, when it goes wrong, it can really go wrong. So you've got to have that sense of looking through all the possible things that might go wrong and mitigating for them before you get started.
That's the thing as well, and that goes back to your point about starting small, doesn't it? Because there are so many, and I suppose tunnel vision as well, because you think internally, you think we've considered all possible avenues, or this could go wrong, this might not be the best way forward, and then you put it out there, and there are just so many things as soon as it's out there in the world. And that's the problem with going into too high without that kind of infrastructure in place, because suddenly you have, God forbid, you have another Microsoft Twitter embarrassment, or even on a larger scale, the Zillow experiment, and it can be catastrophic. Are they still in operation?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are, but they don't use the AI. They don't buy in the property themselves because that didn't work. But yeah, that's absolutely right. You need to be thinking through what could go wrong right from the beginning. So that's the point, isn't it, about, you know, sunk cost bias. If we've spent ages and time and money and, you know, interest, and people's ego is invested in making something work, and then we bring in people from the outside and different perspectives that say, not sure about that. We're not going to like that message. We're going to plough on regardless, which is why you've got to get that consultation and thinking about ethics right from the beginning, so you don't then get into that sunk cost bias.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, I guess, this is a very broad question, but the future of AI then, do you have any kind of ideas on how far it could take us?
I think it will absolutely revolutionise things. When I think back to when I started in business, I'm not quite the era where we had carbon copy. You know, we did have sort of little word processors in the office rather than PCs. But the change from then to what we can do now, what one person in a business can do now, which used to take 10 people to do, and the ways we can interact with each other and support each other and do incredible, powerful, useful things together. And that is just going to massively, massively increase over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I've got kids now that are 17 and 20, and their careers are just going to be so different from anything that I could possibly imagine from now. And it's just about imagination, imagination, drive and skills to just make things happen and see opportunities. And I think for small to medium-sized enterprises, this is a huge opportunity. So again, rather than saying, oh well, we'll wait for a few years and let someone else test it all out first, getting stuck in there now, experimenting, trying with AI. There are lots of no-code and low-code tools out there, so you don't have to know how to code. You just buy into a system where you just, like you can build a website without knowing how to code. You can put the blocks together, make things work, test it out. Wow, that's really interesting. That tells us stuff we didn't know.
No, that's actually really interesting, because I think in terms of AI, it can come across as such a big subject and such a big investment, and everything about it seems huge, and the examples that people often give are like Apple and Google and the big players of the world. And I think sometimes smaller businesses can feel a bit shut out of that conversation. Whereas actually, what you're saying is no, it's much more accessible than you realise if you've just got the spark to invest and look into it. I suppose, what would be your advice to smaller businesses who are just getting started and looking into AI for the first time?
So to get started with AI, I'd say first of all, Google AI use cases. So whatever sector you're in, or if you're an HR specialist, or you're in marketing, or in building balloons, or whatever it is that you do, just Google AI use cases in whatever your interest is, and you'll find there's examples there that you can say, crikey, that's really interesting. And then start a discussion internally, a discussion with the team, discussion with the board, whatever level you want to bring it in at, and just start thinking, what data have we got? What would it be really useful if we could predict? And what would we do with that? Start that discussion going. And on the AI Governance website, there's a checklist for boards, which I think is really helpful, just posing some questions that people can start to get to grips with and just start imagining what they might do. And then the data point is crucial. You can't really do AI if you haven't got much data. So you've got to think about, what have we got? What could we get our hands on in a responsible way? Because maybe there's a lot more data out there that you could put in. So I've been doing a project, for example, on safety in a large industrial business. And what we were trying to do was see if AI could predict ways that we could make people safer at work. Brilliant, good social purpose. And we got things like weather data, which we thought might have an impact on how people are working and whether they're safer or not. We didn't have to pay for that. We could just get the weather data, load it in, code it all up, and there we were. So you can think about other data that you can get. But again, the GDPR point is really important, because if somebody's consented, if I've consented to have my data used by my insurance company to use in their marketing, and then they go and use it to do product development in AI, don't think I've consented for that. Yeah. So, think about how you're using it responsibly, and then finally get support and advice. There are lots of people out there, whether it's the platforms themselves, the low-code and no-code platforms, they want to encourage people to use them, they want to give a lot of help and support, obviously organisations like my own, but lots of people out there who really are passionate about talking about it and evangelising about AI, but also saying what the pitfalls might be.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think, like we said, it does seem like a sort of big players game and a big players market, but when you break it down into kind of, okay, what are your individual or maybe organisational ambitions, and how can AI kind of plug into that, excuse the pun, it's an incredible viewpoint to have, because suddenly then that opens so many opportunities up, and like you mentioned, as long as it's done responsibly from the start, there's really no telling how far it could go and how much it could revolutionise the organisation. And then the next generation then have got such amazing roles to step into. I guess, a lot of, to bring it back, I guess, to the women in business umbrella, a lot of women have often felt a little bit shut out of the conversation when it comes to technology and, particularly with anything to do with development or code or anything like that. Would you give any advice to sort of women either maybe starting in it, or maybe are in a different career similar to yourself and looking to branch into that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I say AI is for everybody. So we need to get out of our heads this image of the sort of 20 a 35-year-old white male as being the AI person. Now, forget that. It's us. It's all of us. By 2024, 80% of technology products will be designed by people who are not tech specialists. Wow, that means us. We're going to be designing the next generation of products. I find that incredibly exciting and really motivational. So if you're an HR specialist at the moment, or you're a technology person, or you're whatever you are, finance, IT, anything, you can be the people that develop these systems in the future. So how do you get started? Well, you've got to have a bit of a passion. You've got to have something that sparks you. So again, just Googling, how is AI being used in whatever it is that your job is at the moment? And you'll get all these ideas that come out. Oh, I didn't know about that. That's amazing. What do you then do with those ideas? Well, go to the boss if you're not the boss already. Go to the boss and say, have you seen this? This is amazing. This is what other organisations are doing. And the boss is probably going to scratch their heads and go, yeah, well, we don't know where to start with that. Okay, fine, so that's all this conversation we've been having about how you get started. But then particularly skills. There is no way that we're going to recruit our way and headhunt our way out of the skills gap that we've got in technology. Absolutely not. There just aren't the people out there globally that have got the data science and AI skills. What does that mean? That means we've got to train more people internally. So if this sort of thing is exciting to you, I'd say to the boss, or if you are the boss, say to yourself, I want to be the person who learns about this. Can I have some time to go and learn about this? There's lots of courses that are free or not very expensive, so perhaps the boss will pay, or perhaps you invest in yourself to say, I want to go out and learn what this is about. And then you become the expert in the business. And this, I think, is a crucial thing that I know as women, sometimes we will self-censor and we'll sort of go, oh, there's bound to be somebody else that's better than me, and you talk yourself out of doing something innovative and creative. No, we've got to talk to ourselves and say, actually, why not me? Might be somebody else as well, but why not me? I'll give it a go. I'll see what happens. I'll become the person who knows more about it. And you very soon will know more about it than anybody else in the business, because so few people know and understand these things. But as I said, there are lots of platforms out there that are low code and no code that really want to invest in skills. And that's right the way from Amazon, they do free courses, and Microsoft, through to some very small and local UK-based businesses. So yeah, get out there, get the skills, learn, educate yourself, and then you will see all sorts of new opportunities open up for you.
I feel quite motivated now, if I'm honest.
Do it.
I think I might take up an AI course. No, it's really interesting, and I think the issue is that there's a kind of stereotype of AI, and then there's the reality of AI. And I think at the moment, in terms of awareness, and this isn't just women, I think it's just across the board, if you're not directly within that sector, your vision of AI is kind of that, okay, it's this massive thing, I'm not really going to get, it's loads of maths, it's loads of engineering, I'm never really going to buy into it. People start this thing when they're 11 and on the computer for the first time, whereas, I'm in my late 20s, 30s, 40s, doesn't matter, it's too late for me. Whereas actually, going back to your original point, start small, work your way outwards, think about what you want to do within your profession and build out from there. And I think the opportunities then are endless. And like you said, you could just absolutely become the AI expert, and suddenly you're set up for an amazing future within technology. I get to, like you mentioned, you kind of started your career before the internet was fully utilised. What do you think you would say to that version of yourself now? I mean, you're on a completely different career path, I guess.
Well, yeah, I guess I would say to my 14-year-old self who had that ZX Spectrum, keep coding, don't stop, keep doing that. And I would say to my 21-year-old self, when I graduated, I had a law degree, but I knew I didn't want to become a lawyer. First person in my family ever to go to university, so I was a bit all at sea and didn't really have any guidance and help to point me in what direction I might go. So I had 2 job offers when I graduated. One was from a company in Bristol to be a trainee recruitment consultant, and one was from a company over in Bath to be a trainee computer programmer. And I took the job in Bristol because I'd just taken a lease on a flat in Bristol and couldn't think how to afford the fare to go over to Bath and couldn't get out of the lease and all the rest of it. But I think if I was talking to my 21-year-old self, I'd say, take that computer programmer job. You have no idea where it's going to lead you. But I didn't do that, so I'm catching up now, just because I don't think doors are ever shut, and we should just keep kicking doors down and just keep persevering and trying new things in our lives, because you don't know where it's going to take you.
Yeah, absolutely, and I completely empathise with your point of being the first person in university. Law seems like such a solid career. You know that there's always going to be demand, and you can really, it's kind of the if your parents wanted you to go into a profession, it would be lawyer,
proper
teacher.
Job, yeah.
Adult job, proper job.
I didn't want a proper job. No, I enjoyed the degree. It was really stimulating, but it wasn't where I wanted to spend my career.
I think what's good is now the generation who are now becoming parents, they kind of recognise how big a part technology can play, and that the proper jobs are now becoming developer, front end, back end, testers, analysts, business analysts, AI specialists. And I think it's incredible the next generation are going to kind of come forward now with this incredible new insight into how we can utilize data and how we can, not just from a sales perspective. And I think that's a kind of, again, another stereotype that people often kind of play into the AI arena, is that it's just for lead generation or sales or purely marketing and kind of like a dark arts type of perspective, when actually it can truly change the world. Yeah. We've seen the impact that AI can have on the NHS and other sectors where learning from the patient is incredibly important, and it's that type of enthusiasm that's going to come forward from the next generation. Have you seen any use cases like that where they've made such a massive impact on people?
Oh, a lovely one. One of my other jobs, I chair an organisation called the Faculty of Clinical Informatics. A long name, but basically it means people working in health and social care who are using data and finding those insights to then use them to make people's lives healthier and better. And the faculty is all about the fact that there's a massive gap, thousands and thousands more people with these skills that we need in the UK over the next 8 or 9 years, up to 2030. So our job as the faculty is to figure out what the standards are that people need to come up to and how to help people get trained and meet those new standards. And one example I came across when I was doing some faculty work the other day was an organisation, I think over in Bath, who'd done some research using Alexa, so simple little sort of pod sitting at home. Lots of people have them, relatively low cost, and they could use that to listen to the sound of an elderly or disabled person in their home environment and work out what was normal for them for moving around, just from the sounds, what was normal for them moving around their home. And then that could flag up when that normal pattern wasn't there, when something abnormal was happening, which might suggest that person is more likely to have a fall. And they could then put things in place to make that person safer, have more help there, perhaps put more railings in or whatever was needed so that they didn't have the fall, didn't end up in hospital, getting pneumonia, having broken hips and all the rest of it. So making people healthier and happier at home for the cost of a simple little pod that in NHS or care organisations can easily afford to have installed. So things like that I think are just genius, where people are not coming up with something that takes enormous amount of new technology and is going to be very expensive, but just, I call it the Apollo 13 mentality. When you say, Apollo 13, the film, when they all went horribly wrong and they're out in space, and the people on the ground locked themselves in a room with just the kit that they had on Apollo 13 and said, let's figure out from here what we can do that those guys is going to get those guys home. And that's my mentality with AI, just Apollo 13, what's the minimum amount of kit that we could do something really useful with? And that works in businesses as well as the health and care environment.
Yeah, and again, that's an amazing example. Sorry, that's absolutely incredible. Yeah. And again, I think awareness is such an important factor here when it comes to AI and technology. People need to know these stories to understand that AI is not investing in some big shiny new thing or hundreds of staff to create something brand new. It's utilizing the systems that we already have and improving them and making them better, and then we can positively impact then vulnerable people's lives or patients that require extra assistance and so on and so forth. But that is absolutely brilliant. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that. I suppose just lastly then, in terms of, I guess, a piece of advice a piece of wisdom that you would offer to those, not necessarily women, but those just entering technology for the first time, what would you say to them?
I would say think about wisdom and integrity in whatever it is you're doing, and you won't go far wrong, because we can get carried away with the excitement of gadgets and tools and making money. This is a big motivator for lots of people. But if we just say, hang on, wisdom and integrity, I can do this, but should I do it? Mm-hmm. If I were doing this and somebody was writing about it and put it on the front page of whatever news media there might be in the future, would I be thinking, yeah, I'm really proud of that and what I did? Would my mum be proud of that? So, but yeah, wisdom and integrity, that's what it's all about.
I feel like that would solve more than one problem in the world if it'd been applied across the board. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such an incredible conversation about AI. Obviously, this is part of our AI special as well. And to be honest, it's just lovely to speak to someone who's so knowledgeable and enthusiastic about AI, and also just for my own sake, really. I feel like I've learned so much from this conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing what bit of AI you want to learn about next.
Yeah, watch this space.